Hello.
Hi.
Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I wanted to say thank you to everybody for joining today. I think this is a really good opportunity for us to sort of have a little bit of cross-course involvement since you'll be spending a lot of your time working with your teams, which is, of course, how clinical trials actually go. You spend a lot of time working with the same people for a lengthy period of time, especially if you're trying to start a trial. So I'm actually in the process of trying to start up a trial, and this is a group that we've been working with on a current trial, but we're starting up a new study with the new version of the shingles vaccine. And we've all worked together for several years, and we're still sort of working out some of the kinks, but especially because this new trial is going to be much larger, we're bringing on new team members. So it's constantly an ongoing learning process, much like it is to get started. So we're going to review today a little bit about where we have been, and then where we're going to go for the remainder of the class. If at any time you have any questions, you can either just speak up, or you can send a chat, or raise your hand, so forth and so on, down at the end of Zoom. So where we've been thus far is we've looked at the history of clinical trials and the ethics of trials. The history of clinical trials, of course, led to the advent of ethics for trials. There were some not so great things that were done to people in the name of science. Unfortunately, some of that still happens a little bit, and we should all always strive to keep in mind that these are people that are very literally giving their life over into your hands in order to benefit science and to sort of benefit the wider population. Obviously to get some help for themselves, but not every trial benefits the people that are in it, especially if there's a placebo control. And so we really want to keep that in mind as we go through planning studies, which took us to grant outlines, which you all will be working on further in the next week as your team to further outline your grants. And I've read the submissions thus far, and they're actually really great. The ideas are sort of really interesting, and we'll look at those in a minute. Talked a little bit about randomization, though this week you're going to see some more information on trial designs. And then we'll have more on randomization and how it actually occurs. So how do you create a randomization scheme, for which I'm going to tell you that you won't. Hopefully you'll work with a statistician that will create your randomization scheme. There are places online where you can get randomization schemes that are relatively simple. The biggest issue with those is that you need to be really mindful that you can't always save them if you do them online. And so if you have an error or a mistake and you go back and generate a new one, it'll be a new randomization scheme. But we'll talk more about that in another module. You've seen some of the basic statistics that are used in clinical trials. Hopefully, if you've really streamlined your question, your clinical trial question, the statistics that you'll be using are pretty well defined. Generally, especially if you're going up in front of the FDA, they don't really like experimental statistical methods or new novel statistical methods. And depending upon the disease area, some of the outcomes and analytical methods are actually chosen for you. So there's a lot of things that you need to be aware of. And that brings us to where you really want to be working with a statistician early on, because they'll have hopefully a little bit more experience in that area. And then you just completed looking at reporting results and the consort statement. So keep in mind that randomized clinical trials are sort of the gold standard, but a lot of what you're learning in this class can apply to observational studies as well, or non-randomized studies, cohort trials. And so if you follow the consort or go find, say, the strobe statement or any of the other associated statements for different types of trials, that's really going to set you up well when you're planning a study. So let's think about where we have the history of trials. And there are a couple of people's trial histories that I wanted to share with the whole class for a couple of reasons. So this is one that was basically covered a broad range of time from 500 BC back in Nebuchadnezzar all the way up to 2006. So this is a good broad overview of some of the pivotal trials and then also some of the trials where things didn't quite go so well and that have really changed the way that we operate. This type of figure is actually a really excellent figure to show perhaps if you are giving a talk. Not so great for a poster or for print because of the black background. So formatting for your audience is actually really key. So depending upon the size of screen you're on right now and the resolution of that screen, you can actually read this very well. It's engaging, you're following the eye, but if you were going to include this in a grant, you'd want to actually make it white background with a black print. Grants are almost always now for people to review or given out online. If people print them, it's likely going to be in black and white. So sort of keep those things in mind when you're preparing a grant, what you would or would not want to include. But this was a really great summary and a very visually interesting way to sort of look at the way that these trials proceeded. There are a couple of other examples that covered from early BC up until present. This is another example of a way to do a timeline, and this is art that was done in PowerPoint with some additional text boxes. And so I'm showing this because it's a really good summary and, again, visually interesting to sort of draw you across to where we are now. One of the things that you'll want to watch out for is that I had to first save this as a PDF and then import it as an image. Because when I copied it from PowerPoint and then tried to put it into my PowerPoint defaults changed all the colors. And it sort of changed the way that things were set up. So just be mindful of that. My recommendation for you when you guys are preparing your grants or any grant is that your images that you import, you make somewhere, save as an image, and put into the file. Because if you submit something into a PDF maker, you never know how that's going to work. And it may really distort what you're trying to show. So make sure that when you're submitting and preparing a grant, that it's submitted and prepared as a PDF and that everything looks the way that you want it to look. Here is a more in-depth but recent history of pivotal trials. So this one started in the 1750s and came up through 2015. I liked the formatting of this one because each of the boxes follows the same format. So once you read the James Lind scurvy trial, it's followed by the length of the trial, what they did, and then how it helped. So there's a very consistent and clear format here. This obviously stretched long, but for the PowerPoint, it wouldn't quite fit there. But again, this was really well done in terms of the design, and then it was easy to follow in terms of what was being presented. So consistency in grant preparation is really key as well. And then this final one I wanted to show because this particular student, instead of doing a broad history of pivotal trials, actually did a history of pivotal trials in one area. So an area that they are interested in, and went back and looked at the approval, and I'm just showing the timeline here. There was additional documentation with it that talked about each of these studies, but the timeline here shows very clearly when drugs were approved or when there was FDA approval for treatment of ovarian cancer. And it's so interesting to think that this really is a very recent history for us. But you can see in past 2010 how things have really started to improve in the research realm for ovarian cancer. So why did I actually have you go do this, aside from making sure that you were paying attention to the history of the trials? All of your grant submissions are going to require background and scientific rationale. So every grant that you do, no matter what the format or no matter what the funding agency, this holds true actually for submissions of abstracts, posters, and manuscripts, is what's the background in that area and why did you do this new study? So if you go back here, say to ovarian cancer, the student that prepared this has a very sort of broad scope to refer back to in terms of which medications were approved when, and that would lead up to the medication or the intervention that they're looking at now. So you may not necessarily have to include a history like this or a figure like this in your grant, but you knowing that history specific to your area is very key. And creating something like this for you, for yourself, or to include in the grant would really help you or the reviewers understand why you're doing this new trial. And I say that because particularly for statisticians that are reviewing your grant, they may not have the content area background that you do. And so including a detailed and clear history of what got you to where you are now, and I don't just mean like the one prior trial that showed something and now you want to do it again. I mean, you really need to sort of back up a little bit and give a broader picture so that those people who are reviewing your grants, whether it be somebody who has disciplinary knowledge, or if it happens to be, say, in the Department of Defense, I review for them. And on our panels, we have consumer reviewers. That's true multiple sclerosis as well. A lot of times they have people with the disease or who are caregivers or who are rehab specialists. You'll get now, if you've ever submitted something through UAB, you'll know that you have to talk about intellectual property. So you'll have IP experts reviewing the grant to make sure that there aren't any conflicting issues and what happens if the grant is successful. You'll have statisticians as well. And then you'll have an ethicist or a bioethicist if you're looking at samples who are reviewing your informed consent. And so all of those specialist reviewers is what we're called, may not have the scientific background or the disease knowledge that you're assuming that people do. So be very careful about presenting the history so that it makes clear your background and the scientific rationale for your reviewers. It becomes very helpful for you to have an understanding and to be able to convey that. And figures are often very helpful. They certainly don't have to be as detailed as these prior ones were. But something like this, even if you're looking at 2010 to 2020, would be very helpful for a reviewer to sort of get the landscape of where this trial is going to fit in. Since y'all have looked at the consort diagram, consort is a great design guide. These are all things that are required of publications. So when you present, you'll need to make sure that you talk about each of these things, which means you should have planned for each of those things. The last thing you want to have happen is to get to the end of the study and realize that you have to report on your missing data and realize that you haven't been tracking that, which hopefully you would have been tracking that. But the consort's a great place to start as a design guide because it's the end game. It's what you'll need to report. So those are certainly things that are really important to think about as you're planning your study. Your statistics section, which we're going to delve a little bit more deeply into those pieces now that we've gone through trial administration and the history and the ethics. But you should always be collaborating with a statistician, even if it's a small study, even if you have some statistical training. There are organizations throughout large research institutions like the CCTS or the biostats department. We have the Cancer Center that has their biostats group. And then we actually, all over campus, there are statisticians that are hired now by departments or have cross appointments with departments who do have that disease knowledge. And so that makes the collaboration a lot easier. As you are starting out in your research realm, it's really beneficial to you to make friends with us. Because there are also younger statisticians or assistant professors or statisticians that are just starting out, biostatisticians, and I should also say epidemiologists, who are also looking to develop a sort of career portfolio in specific areas. And that's basically, sort of how we operate. I have broad disease knowledge now in multiple sclerosis and rheumatoid arthritis, emergency medicine, sleep apnea, because I've had collaborations with faculty members who are doing work in those areas, and we've done multiple projects together now. And that really speeds up the grant submission process because they don't generally have to go back and sort of expand again what the history of the area is. Statisticians are going to help you with design, specifically randomization and blinding or masking, and then the analysis section. I think one of the things that that's a big pitfall in first-time or second-time grant submissions from researchers is that they have the conversation with the statistician, they talk about the basic design, the statistician does the power and sample size, which comes under the design part, and they don't ever get a chance to read the whole grant, or these take 6 months, or should take about 6 months to write, if not longer. And what happens a lot of times in first or second time submissions, plus people are busy, is that you start to pull this together in the last month, you insert the statistical section, and off it goes. The problem is that those of us that review them can tell pretty easily when the statistician hasn't actually read the whole grant. And a lot of times the biggest giveaway on that is you have hypotheses that are one-sided. So you're trying to show that something is better than something else. And then your statistics section is written entirely in, we want to show that they're different than. So that's a two-sided test. And that's a huge pet peeve of mine. It just shows that there hasn't been cohesion in the grant submission process from the statistician and the grant writing team. Another big red flag that there hasn't been collaboration is the budgeting for the statistical help. Your statistical budget should be pretty consistent throughout the study, and particularly should actually increase as you close the study, because the statistician will be doing the analysis and will be writing about 2/3 of your presentations and papers for you, if you get a good one, or at least the rough drafts of those. So it is pretty obvious if it hasn't been cohesively written. Another thing that I find humorous, and it's happened to me, is that people will take a stat section written for a different grant and submit it with a new grant. So these aren't interchangeable, right? Your statistics section should be very cohesive when you get to writing that. Each of you on your team either has a biostatistician student or an epi student, and so lean on them when you guys move into the next parts of planning to talk about the design and the analysis parts. You can also lean on me and ask some questions. So this week where you all are, and this is a large module this week. The module next week during 4th of July is actually a pretty light module. So we've sort of front-ended a lot of the content this week that will lead into some of the issues for next week. So you're looking at trial design, you're looking at the types of interventions, and you're looking at the trial administration details. So you guys have about 2 hours of video for this module this week, and then it'll be pretty light next week in terms of video. I think there's only 4 shorter videos over the holiday week. And you'll have 2 assignments for next week, 1 individual and 1 team to collaborate on. So it's pretty light for next week with sort of front-loading a little bit of it this week. Where we're going from here, next week we'll look at specifically defining the question. And if you remember back to grade school grammar, where they talked about diagramming a sentence, people think they'll never use that again. It turns out that diagramming a sentence comes in really helpful when you're trying to define a question. And then outcomes and endpoints. So you guys have already sort of picked your primary endpoint, but we're going to talk about how to choose a measurement or an outcome to measure that. And we'll talk about power and sample size next week. So power and sample size isn't something that most of you will ever be performing yourself, but you should really have an idea of the components that are involved in power and sample size, so that when you're collaborating with your team, you know what information that you need to have to sort of estimate these things. You'll get to perform power and sample size yourself next week. So if you haven't already, go back to the course softwares and make sure that you've downloaded and installed the Vanderbilt power and sample size software. It's freeware, and it can be operated both on the PC and the Mac. But it's pretty straightforward, and you'll get an idea and get an assignment that lets you play around a little bit to see how things change when you're planning a study. Then we're going to move into the actual administration of the trial. So sample selection, recruitment and retention, and then we'll look at follow-up of the participants' visits and study termination for the participants. Individual study termination is different than study closeout. So that whole section, follow-up visits and study termination, It's actually directly related to your data collection, your data quality. We'll talk about starting up your study and the actual process of treatment allocation and randomization. And then we'll talk about study monitoring, which should be something that happens all the way through the trial. And when I say study monitoring, I don't simply mean making sure that the dates on consent forms match. I mean actually monitoring your data. And I don't simply mean just for, is what's on this paper correct in the system? We're going to talk a lot more about ways that you can capture issues that are happening in your study and fix them early on by cross-monitoring on forms, by monitoring the data within centers so that you can see if you have any issues with the way that data is being collected. For example, we had one center in a trial about 10 years ago whose primary outcome was consistently 1 point higher than every other center. Now, it could be that they had an interesting population that they were collecting from, but it turns out their participants at baseline were very similar to every other participant because our inclusion and exclusion criteria were pretty specific. And so we had to really delve into why their endpoints were coming out higher than everywhere else and see if we couldn't figure it out and remedy it, which we did. It was a training issue with the observational nature of the primary outcome. So talking about study monitoring is really key. We'll also talk about statistical analysis plans and what should be included in them versus what's in the grant. So your grant's going to be maybe about a page, depending upon where you're submitting, a page or 2 pages of statistical analysis, but you'll have a separate statistical analysis plan. And then we'll talk about study closeout. So what's involved from the administrative and statistical parts of study closeout. And then we'll actually talk about getting your grant reviewed, and you all will be cross-reviewing your teams for this class, and we'll have a mock study review there. So that takes me here to the modules that we have left. We just released Module 4. Module 5 will be for next week, and then we'll go into 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. The grant reviews will take place during finals week, so we don't have a final exam for this class. I will be sending out a doodle poll for you all for the grant review section for the finals week time. And so it may occur later in the evening or over lunch, but we will need to find a time, and I'm going to send that out next week, so that people can clear their schedules and make sure it's on their schedule where we can all meet face-to-face and do a full course grant review. If it turns out you're traveling that week or have other issues, then maybe we can work that out well in advance. So that's really where we are now, what we've done and where we are now and where we're headed. Let me stop my sharing here. If I can figure that out. I'm going to end my sharing and see if you all have any questions for me or anything that you'd like to talk about this week, anything that's come up or any other questions that you have.
Just want to clarify, the meeting you mentioned about in the final week is like face-to-face meeting, right?
It's going to be on Zoom.
Oh, okay, then that will be working for me. So
yeah, it'll be via Zoom. So hopefully we'll have a nice square of all the videos here.
Oh, that would be great because I'm not in the States during this time, but it's okay.
Yeah, I'm not either. Well, I'm in the United States. I'm not in Alabama. You guys want to see my view? This is my summer office. See if it'll show up. Here we are. I'm over in coastal Georgia for right now. And then here's my office assistant. He's down there. That's Oliver. If you came on a little bit early, we got to hear him bark because the lawn guys showed up. So, do we have questions about the class or things about your team progressing? I seem on top. Yes.
Ways. Is this meeting like mandatory meeting? Because I cannot make it like every week, every Wednesday at 11. So
No, it's not mandatory. It's just nice to be able to see everybody. We won't have one next week because July 4th, but in 2 weeks we'll have one. And in 2 weeks, we're going to spend more time talking about each of the individual grant proposals. So I'm going to send out the proposals thus far to everybody, and we'll look for comments from your non-team members, from the other classmates, about questions or things they have about your grant. But they're all recorded, so.